Hey guys, this is Joe748, and I'm here with SD1, and our special guest today is Dr. Timothy Fong. Dr. Timothy Fong is a leading expert on gambling addiction. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, and he's the co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies Program. It's a research and treatment center that's studying the various aspects of gambling behavior. How are you doing, SD1?
Joe, I'm always fantastic rolling with you, man. You know that.
Nice. And thank you, Dr. Fong, for coming on. You know, we heard about you. We did a podcast with Brian Hatch. I believe you did a podcast with him, the All In podcast, a while back. And we got a lot of good responses from that. So we kind of wanted to do a follow-up podcast with someone who is in the professional field studying gambling addiction, gambling behavior, and wanted to get your take on it. But first, how did you even get into this specialty?
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's always great to reach a different audience than I typically work with. I went to medical school at Northwestern, 1994 to 1998. And right during that time, there was a surge of riverboat gambling in Chicago. And that was one of the activities that a number of my friends and I did during medical school. And it was always just fascinating, the stories that you see on the boats, the people you meet. I always had an interest in just gambling in and of itself. When I came to psychiatry residency in 1998, the first thing I saw coming into LA was a sign for a local card club and horse race track right near LAX. So I didn't know that California had a lot of gambling. And as I went through my residency in psychiatry in 1998 to 2002, remember what happened in the gambling world. We had internet gambling 1.0. We had pre-poker boom, right? We had expansion of Las Vegas. We had tribal gaming in California expanding. So gambling was starting to become, quote, normalized. It was starting to become an activity that people were starting to do more and more of. But for me as a psychiatrist, I did not see a lot of men and women with, quote, gambling addiction show up into the emergency rooms or in our clinics or call for help. And I always thought, what's the deal here? And how do you get, quote, addicted to a behavior if there's no substance? Why aren't we seeing more people? What's the deal with the internet? And even then, I imagine there's going to be a day where the casino in our pockets, and that's got to change the fabric of gambling and all these things. So put it all together, I've always been interested in gambling myself. I've been around gambling a long time, growing up in the, quote, mean streets of Chicago, which is really the suburbs of Chicago. And it was just a perfect timing to explore neuroscience, behavior, addiction, gambling, the internet, psychiatry, and kind of all blended together. But really how I got into it, I met a man named Richard Rosenthal, was my mentor in gambling. And he studied gambling behavior. He learned a lot from Dostoevsky, The Gambler, the book. And he had a private practice full of men and women with gambling disorders. I sought his counsel and mentorship out in 2002. And it's really where together, that's where we built our UCLA Gambling Studies program from there.
Nice. I mean, I think a lot of the general public now at this point has become aware, or at least admits that gambling is addictive and that there's something going on. But what is actually happening neurologically when someone is addicted to gambling?
By nature, right? Gambling is risky. Gambling is exciting. Gambling offers, wins and losses, anticipation, and things in between. I think about the other behaviors that we do all the day: reading, writing, watching TV, exercising, sexual activities. All these things stimulate and activate the brain in terms of various neurochemicals and things like that. When it comes to gambling, it's doing the same thing. It's activating the regions of our brains that are responsible for pleasure, excitement, reward, motivation, math, attention. It's also, in very many ways, activating other parts of the brain that deal with loss and failure and anger and all those emotional things. So, like substances of misuse, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, whatnot, we know that when they get into the body, they predominantly activate brain regions in our pleasure centers, the midbrain of the brain. You may have heard of nucleus accumbens, and the various neurochemicals are impacted, serotonin, dopamine, and various things like that. So I always tell people gambling activates the brain, just like running, just like playing tennis, just like seeing a great movie. But what's different is how people are built. Some people, their brains get really super activated when thinking about gambling or while gambling. And there are others where brains, they just shut down and you feel nothing. We know that 60% of the country gamble, but that means 40% don't. We all have friends and people in our lives that think gambling is just silly and they have an aversion to it, right? It's just not there. Some people love steak, some people love lobster. So what's happening inside our brain is a complex story of brain regions that get activated by sight, sound, smells, anticipation, the thought of gambling. And again, the main region of the brain that are being activated are those pleasure centers. That's what's responsible for what sometimes people feel, the excitement, the anticipation, the thrill of victory. And for some, even when they lose, that's still thrilling in of itself. It's kind of like, why do certain people like horror movies? They just like to be scared. Some people are drawn to the gambling because of them, not because of the wins, but because of the losing.
How much of it is a predisposition opposed to situational? And when I ask that, we're in casinos a lot. So we see the same people over and over and over. And obviously the casinos and the casino businesses that create the slot machines in particular, they have psychologists that work with them when they create these slot machines with the keys, that the sound and keys that that machine plays, certain things that it does with near wins. Does that create, or can it create, problem gambling in somebody that might not have a genetic disposition? So I guess it's kind of two parts. You see both of them, but then on the other side, can some be created as a result of those tricks?
Yeah, and the answer is yes to both. So here's what we know. We know that all addictive disorders, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, gambling, whatever, about 50% of the story is genetics. And the other 50% is environment and, life exposure, life experience related to that issue. So people say, okay, well, what's the genetic risk that's happening in gambling? There's several things we've uncovered. Again, some people are just naturally drawn to experience an intense pleasure and high and excitement from gambling. That's genetics. Some folks have a genetic predisposition where when they lose, it doesn't really hurt that much. So you think about one of the conditions of addiction is persistence, resilience, grit. I took a class once on how to play craps, and the teacher was like, hey, if you're going to be a really successful craps player, you have to have strong quads because you're going to be standing at the table for 12 hours. You're laughing because I laughed too. I said, that's ridiculous. Why would I want to stay at the craps table for 12 hours? So some people are genetically built where they can tolerate gambling for hours, right? Then there's some folks who are genetically able to tolerate losses. You'd have a big loss, $500, $1,000, $2,000. Many folks the next day are like, so that's gross. I don't want to do this again. I'm just never going to gamble again. But what do folks with gambling disorder have? The next day, they're like, you know what? It's a new day. I'm lucky today. I'm going to go back and fight. I'm going to go back and get even. I'm going to chase my losses. I'm not going to allow this to happen. I'm going to fight. So those are all genetically driven sorts of things. You combine that with what gambling and what makes gambling so potentially addictive and attractive. It's the intermittent reinforcement, meaning you never know when you're going to win. You never know where you're going to lose. It's profound potential big jackpots that might be coming. So again, life-changing rewards that could happen at any minute, right? And then you combine them with, again, the games that have all the lights and bells and whistles and tricks that get people to stick. And that's a wide variety of things that people do inside brick and mortar. But look, a lot of those brick and mortar, the online gaming stuff on our phones is just as, quote, habit forming and as addictive as the brick and mortar. So it's not just the oxygen or the cocktails or the brick and mortar escapism. It's the game itself. So you put it all together, again, what creates risk for addiction is a combination of biological risk, psychological risk, and social risk factors. That's true for all addictions and mental health. When it comes to gambling, again, the biological risk is they're just people are born this way to experience gambling in a very different way than people without this disorder. But there's also, biological risk for drug and alcohol addiction, So when people have substance use disorder, it then becomes much easier to develop a gambling addiction. We get that. And there's some personality traits like impulsivity. We mentioned a little bit like what would I call loss aversion, but impulsivity is another genetically driven risk factor. The ability to take risks and act without thinking about the consequences. And you all have lots of experience inside casinos. And you know what I'm talking about. You're like, why did that person just randomly decide to quadruple their base bet for no reason? That's a perfect impulsive act. Why did someone who lost their initial stake say, you know what, screw this, I'm going to keep fighting? That's an impulsive act. And they go hit the ATM. We know that's a bad idea. They do it anyway. That's a very impulsive, spur of the moment kind of thing. A lot of the tendency to be impulsive is driven by genetic risk, genetic profile. Some people are just born more impulsive. But so it's both. And then you can imagine the environment, which again fuels ongoing engagement. Another example, what's increased risk over the last 15 years is just credit, the availability of online credit. Now, in the brick and mortar casinos, of course, it's markers, right? But it's ATMs. And, you have an unlimited amount of credit you can get. What we're seeing now that's probably the most concerning is people getting online credit through, online payday loans and the ability to get micro loans, $500, $1,000 within a matter of minutes, not days, minutes. So when I was in college, if I wanted to take out a loan, it took like a month to get cleared, right? You go interview and talk to some banker, right? Now I've had patients in the middle of the night, they just apply for a loan and it's funded in their PayPal or their online bank accounts within a matter of an hour. So meaning that's an example of external environmental factors that can raise the risk of addiction. I think fundamentally a lot of people will worry about, well, how do I protect myself? Well, again, we know some cases, all three risk factors, biological, psychological, social, are there. In other cases, it's just one. So it's just every story is really, really different. But, it's about as simple as I can say. Why that matters is that I think a lot of folks who have these biological risk factors, they still blame themselves. They still say, you know what, it's my fault I became a quote gambling addict, or I don't have willpower, I'm greedy, or I'm selfish, or I'm just morally bankrupt. That's why I landed in this world. And that's a terrible thing to think about. And that just leads to a lot of shame and guilt.
When we spoke to Brian Hatch, two things like really stood out in that podcast. The first being the story he shared of somebody in his gambler group. I don't remember the number. How much did she lose, Joe?
$400,000.
$400,000 in a online fake casino, meaning she could not even win money. It was just buying the tokens because the game, like to your point earlier, just grabbed her and that compulsion, and she was in it. And there was not even an ability to win actual dollars.
Yeah, those social casino games, yes.
Yeah, and the second thing was the rate at which suicide attempts happen among addicted gamblers. I don't think I'd ever heard that stat before. What was it?
Like
do you remember what?
1 in 4, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll get into this more later, but I'm just curious why that isn't talked about enough. I mean, I realize that the casinos run the quote unquote problem gambling by handing out their pamphlets and providing a number, and that's about all they do. But it seems like in your world, I always hear these stats quoted about, this small percentage are addicted gamblers. And you don't hear about the 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 suicide attempts, but also like from our perspective, being in the casinos all the time, I just cannot believe that the number of addicted gamblers is as low as they quote. Just because you don't run out of money and you're not destitute doesn't mean you don't have a problem.
Right. These are great insights. I'd love to hear more about your experience inside casinos. Here's what we know. We know, yes, these national survey studies and stuff that's out there suggests about 1% to 2% of the general population walking around. We did a study a few years back. We went inside a casino and we sat there for 4 days straight. And we just handed out gambling prevalence, gambling behavior surveys. And we established a rate of about close to 40% of men and women inside that casino met active criteria for gambling addiction. That number I thought was low. I thought it was going to be like 80%. But those were people who were willing to do our survey.
Yeah.
Again, you go to any bar in America, what percentage of these guys and gals have alcohol use disorder? We don't really know. If you go into a drug using den gallery where people are using heroin and fentanyl, it's going to be like 100% of them have some sort of addiction problem. It's not a casual place you go. So the 1 in 4 number is 1 in 4 men and women with gambling disorder who are actually going into treatment have reported having attempted suicide at one point. And of all the addictions, why is that? Number one, because money is such a painful emotional object. So we equate our self-worth with how much money we have in the bank account. If you have a lot of money, you are a good person, you are a smart person. If you lost money, you are an idiot, you are stupid, you are a shame, you are a scourge. That's stigma, right? And then you create, again, the combinations of gambling disorder clients who have higher rates of other mental health problems, depression, ADHD, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders. Well, that escalates the amount of addiction. Then you pile on top of that personality traits of people being impulsive, spontaneous, and having what we call lethal emotional pain in an instant. You've all, I'm sure, had times where you lost a lot and it hurt a lot. And then, right? And then you imagine in that moment, if you had no hope and if you're like, screw this, I see no way out. It is overwhelming financially to say, oh my gosh, I have $50,000 in debt. I make $25 an hour. It's going to take me 20 years to pay that off. That's an overwhelming thought. So screw it. I might as well just jump off the building and collect the life insurance for my family. It's literally what happens, right? While high or while intoxicated or while sleep deprived after a long bender, which also increases impulsivity. So it makes sense to me why people are going to have a higher than expected rate. The expected rate of number of people who want to kill themselves every year is about 1% of the general population too. So it's not zero. So pile all that together, why aren't we people screaming from the rooftops? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, there's not a lot of anti-gambling lobby groups. Number two, it's hard to tease out cause of death from gambling. So I've had patients, who die from gunshot wounds or car accidents, drug overdoses, or jumping from buildings. The cause of death is gunshot wound to the head, drug overdose. The cause of death isn't gambling. Gambling may have led to the gunshot wound to the head. So tracking that is not easy. We can easily pinpoint in our country 100,000 Americans dead every year for the last 10 years because of drug overdoses. Thankfully, that number is going down, which is great, but it's still really high. 60, 70,000 Americans dead every year. That's as many that died in the Vietnam War, right? But you don't see people yelling and screaming from the rooftops that we have, a Vietnam War level amount of deaths every year in America and we don't want to tolerate it. You just don't. But people get used to that. So this stuff gets buried and people don't point, well, who's really responsible? Unfortunately, I think it's the false notion is so people still feel that people who kill themselves, you know what? You did it to yourself. You're ultimately responsible. That's on you. And that's not quite right. I look at it, I think all these parties are responsible. You're right. Casino industries could do a lot better prevention, early intervention, things like that. The credit card industry financial industries can do the same thing. Imagine a bank that sees all these transactions all the time. Do they not have a duty to say that, hey, you're making a ton of transactions, which is very different than your traditional banking. But we view it as un-American to intervene. We view it as it's my God-given right to lose as much money as I want. I remember when I was starting this career off, the riverboats in Iowa, right? They put in a rule once, which said you can only lose X amount of money, $500 maximum in 24 hours. And once you're done, we're not giving you any more money. Well, there was huge protest by the citizens that said, no, it's literally my God-given right to lose as much money as I damn well please. Pardon my French, but that was something where I realized, again, we view gambling with a very different lens than we view tobacco, alcohol, and, other substances there about how much you can actually consume. But you pile all that together, again, that's where the nature is that this is a disorder that we now know is an addiction. It's fairly prevalent. It's about the same prevalence rate as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And when people develop this disorder, I don't like to say when they quote get it, like the flu, but when they develop into this disorder and the gambling is harmful despite consequences, it's really awful. It's really, really terrible. But thankfully, the vast majority of people who gamble on a regular basis do not develop very advanced gambling addiction. So it's a weird twist. So you might see regulars inside the casino all the time, but that's their church, that's their coffee shop. That's what they do. And when you actually do interviews of them and the damage, yeah, it costs them a lot, but it's not creating this long lasting damage like true addiction is. So it may be somewhat unhealthy, but that's just what they like doing. It's their country club, for lack of a better word. And it's weird to think that way, but other countries use casinos like a social institution. I remember being in Sweden one time, and there was a group of young college kids that were just studying in the casino. I said, "Well, what are you guys doing here? Why? Oh, this is very lovely here, and we're studying. You know it's a casino. Are you going to gamble? No, but we're just going to gather." We don't think of that in America. We still view the casino kind of as this far off place, this mysterious place, dangerous, right? Exciting, but maybe you really shouldn't be here every day. So those are some general thoughts I think about when I think about the impact of gambling disorder and how we frame it right now.
You said that you had, in speaking about thankfully the vast majority don't qualify for the gambling addiction, but then you also spoke about the people that answered your survey when you spent 4 days straight in a casino being around 40%. So I have this whole theory because of what we see, and we see behind the curtain. We see the Wizard of Oz and what he really looks like and how gamblers are treated. And once they find out you're a winner, how we are treated after the fact. But my whole theory is that if we could magically pluck all the problem gamblers out of the casino, 90% of the casinos would falter. They'd go out of business because so much of their revenue comes from problem gamblers.
Yeah. It's been an interesting debate the entire career that I've been in studying this. And I've heard figures as high as 80% of the revenue generated on the backs of men and women with a gambling addiction. I've heard 10%. I've heard 20%. We really don't know because there's not a lot of great studies. There's not a lot of objective studies that are funded to look at that. But we do know a few things from other fields of addiction: alcohol, tobacco, cannabis. Stories are always the same. The people that consume the most amount are the ones with problems and do generate a very high percentage of revenue for that industry. It just happens to be. Now, Vegas is a little bit of a funny story, right? Where over the last 15, 20 years, a big chunk of their revenue isn't coming from gambling, right? It's from parking fees and clubs. I went to the Sphere. My God, I paid $500 to see the Eagles. And you go to dinner at a, nice steak restaurant and you're paying $400. Whatever. The point is that the percentage of their revenue generated by gambling has shrunk considerably compared to the 70s and 80s. But that still doesn't, take away the fact that, yes, ethical question ought to be is what percent should we as a society tolerate revenue being generated on the backs of people who are really vulnerable, who have a condition? And again, it's the same thing. It's like what percentage of McDonald's revenue is generated by people who are obese and have diabetes? It's hard because many folks with gambling disorder are not aware that they have an addiction. They just know they have life problems. And they'll say, "Oh, I don't have an addiction. I have a problem with luck. Or I got screwed by the casino. Or my wife doesn't understand what I do. And my system is infallible. It just, it just needs time to work." And again, I mentioned, I took this class. I learned about the martingale system, right? In theory, it's infallible, right? But what stops the martingale system is table limits, right? 31 parlay, same thing. In theory, great way to minimize your losses, but it's not fun. And eventually you're going to get caught. That's just math. So I was always fascinated by these systems, as I got into the field. And then that same craps class, you guys spent years counting cards. I must have spent 50 hours trying to preset dice.
Dice control.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
And here I was a resident thinking, oh, I can control the dice. And I sat there for literally hours convincing myself I could do this. But it goes back to our human nature need to control things that we can't control. The larger question you have there, again, I'll put that out there, is what percentages of revenue should be brought in on the backs of people with an active clinical condition? And it's hard. I mean, the other thing, there are a lot of men and women with dementia, Alzheimer's, that gamble. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Is that a good thing?
We see it.
You see it. I see it I see it in the casinos too. And the slot machines are incredibly complicated, and no one understands these rules. They just hit the button, and things go. You can't tell me they really understand what's actually happening in terms of risk and things like that. So if you have dementia, you still have freedom of choice. But, if you go into a bar, I think it's a lot less likely a bartender is going to serve you if you have severe advanced dementia and can't tell what's going on. So that's not always true, say, if you go into a cannabis dispensary. So again, the problem exists that, the casino industry knows that, and they recognize that, and they do some lip service, and they do the things that they're supposed to do from the regulatory standpoint. But the larger, simpler question really, again, is, are we okay with it? Are we okay with vulnerable individuals continuing to spend their money through their own free will, even though they have vulnerable brains and minds, to be able to hold on to that money?
What do you think is the most immoral thing you've seen the casino industry do to exploit people's addictions?
I've heard a lot. I've heard of, well, number one, breaking the law. So I've had cases where patients of mine were given, illicit substances, pills, drugs, sex workers. I mean, that's pretty dark stuff, right? I have no idea how often that really happens, but I've had several patients that told me that. The worst are the enticements, without a doubt. I have a woman right now I've been working with for about 10 years, and we have a very strong therapeutic relationship, and she's doing her very best to maintain recovery. And then every now and then she'll log on to her player's account, or she'll get a call or a text for free play. How can anyone resist $500 at the Bellagio and free chips? That is very difficult.
Is she self-excluded?
On some casinos, but others not. And she absolutely refused to eliminate her player's account because she said, I got so many points in there and it'd be a tragedy. And I'm like, that's on you. You got to get rid of it. They're not going to stop it. But I think the immorality goes into, they know her practice. They know her patterns of expenditures are exceptionally high. They've never had a conversation with her to say, where are you getting the money? How is it impacting your life? So maybe she's an heiress and, throwing down $400,000 or $500,000 a year is nothing. Or maybe she's a working class person who makes $60,000 a year and has now all these credit card debts. They don't know. So I do think that's an area where there is no personal relationship, where they are actually applying a means test to determine high volume players. Can you really do this without incurring harm? That's number one. Number two, again, the enticements that are profoundly seductive, I think, are really, really, frankly, cruel. That's what they are. I mean, I look at, like, when I was going to Vegas 20 years ago, you get what? Oh, match play for $20, right? Or, here's a coupon book to get a free margarita. I mean, these are very light enticements, right? They're not going to get anyone, quote, addicted. But what is nowadays are, like, online, casinos or online sports books. Sign up now and get $1,000 in free credit. These are big enticements. So definitely the things I've seen are really that. It's just not developing when there's actually a casino host relationship. And that host's incentive is to draw more money out of that client and not to interview that client and determine whether or not they should meet the criteria of gambling disorder or really, frankly, should be part of their business at all. It's kind of like the movie Owning Mahoney, right? Have you two seen that? If you haven't seen that, you guys are young, but Owning Mahoney was a movie with Philip Seymour Hoffman, and it was about gambling disorder. And in it, he's inside a casino, and there's a valet who's considered his lucky valet. And he wins and wins and wins, and then eventually he loses it all. During the course of play, the valet's like, Mr. Mahoney, walk away from the table right now, right? And then later on, there's another cut to him later on, he loses all the money. casino manager says to the valet, thank you for, providing good customer service. Never tell a customer to stop gambling. You're fired. So that's pretty gross. And it's stuff like that we wonder about. But again, those are some examples that I see. I'm sure you guys have seen other things there as well. And I think lastly, again, just the idea that casinos just not intervening when there is a clear evidence they ought to. So someone staying there 24 hours straight, I mean, that can't be fun. Somebody who's upset and crying and continuing to battle and going back to the ATM multiple times, and they're gambling by themselves, they're not there with friends. To me, that's a pretty obvious sign. If you don't intervene, understanding why not, I think that's the story that we want to hear.
Or even just drunk. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've seen somebody drunk. Like, you're talking about a massive financial decision, and we make this example all the time. Would you ever be serving alcohol at the closing of your mortgage? Or let somebody that's drunk do that massive financial transaction, and yet they just keep feeding it? And I've heard that there is some unspoken rule that they should be cutting somebody off if they're too intoxicated to play, like a bartender has a responsibility, cut off service, or they could be sued. But I've never actually seen it. The only thing I've seen is they tap them on the shoulder if they fall asleep at a slot machine and say, hey, if you fall asleep here, we have to throw you out, but here's another chance. That's all I've ever seen.
Yeah, I've seen people get loud and get tossed out for screaming, yelling, and throwing chips, but that's rare, right? And we all know that people with gambling disorder are tend to be the quietest one. Like this woman, I said, do you ever gamble with people? Never. Where do you prefer? Which slot machines do you like? Furthest one from the action, right? Dealers, right? They oftentimes are trained, and they're human too, and they're trained in quote responsible gambling. But the interaction is hard. I will say that here in California, what our casinos are very good at is self-exclusion. If you are on that list and you play and they recognize you, they say, no, well, your business is not welcome here. Because that's the law. If you win a jackpot, you have to verify that ID, and they run it across the database. And if your name comes up, that jackpot is sacrificed to the state of California. You don't get it. So there are some things that happen. I definitely think there's a lot more that should happen. But again, brick and mortar casinos are very different than online social casinos or online sports books, where there's zero chance of a human interaction. It's just chat. It's just random stuff. And I think that's where the difference lies, for sure.
Yeah, I think brick and mortar are evil, but online is extremely dangerous. The states that have gone to full-blown online casinos, and let's not kid ourselves, every sports book casino operator wants there to be online gaming outside of sports books as well.
Absolutely. That's where the money's at.
Yeah, and we've said, like, I've heard several advantage players, people in our group say, we have yet to even see a small slice of the damage that's going to be done from the online sports betting and then the online casinos. I mean, I can't even turn on any basic sports program without there being talk of gambling on the games right now.
Yeah, we're redefining entertainment. We're redefining sports entertainment. We're redefining gambling in a pace that's way faster than it was in the 80s or 90s for certain. I oftentimes, when it goes back to brick and mortar casino, ask basic questions. Why do we need these things 24 hours a day? And I remember as we were expanding in a tribal casino about 10 years ago, there was this argument like, well, why does it need to be 24 hours? And the counter was, for shift workers who want to have fun. That's why. So, and who was it that said, was it Barkley or someone said nothing really good happens at 3 a.m, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're Mark Wahlberg and you're working out. But, so questions like that. Or questions like, why are we linking gambling like in the lottery to schools? And that's such a false connection. We shouldn't be doing that. But again, brick and mortar casinos have gone through, a lot of change, even just in the last 5 years after COVID. But yeah, I would absolutely agree that there are some business practices I think that are just not healthy. There are others to say that this is still their business. Their business is to get you to spend money inside their place of business. It's interesting. I don't hear a lot about gambling inflation. I don't know if you guys have heard that, like eggs and all that. Well, look, the Mega Millions now just raised their entry fee from $2 to $5. Last time I checked, that's a hefty price hike. And where's our government saying, lower the price of the lottery so it's not out of the reach of, the middle class? So, but you're right. I mean, again, casinos are a funny world. And again, if we viewed them as pillars of social institution like churches and the malls or bars, it's going to be, a different way we view at it. I remember years ago, I had an idea of like, well, why don't we create like mental health clinics or primary health care clinics inside a casino? We're doing that in the mall. We should just throw it in the casinos. And a couple of casino operators said, well, I don't know. That just feels a little like we're bringing too much of the real world into our world. And I thought that was interesting because they said to me, well, should they do that in Disneyland? I said, I don't know. I mean, do you think there should be a primary care office in Disneyland? And you go to Disneyland, you get your cholesterol checked, you get your, your diabetes checked while you're at Disneyland. Do we want that? And that's really when I realized, again, casinos are going to want to define themselves in however way they want on their own. It's on us to say, hey, you know what? We don't like this. We don't like the way casinos are headed. Or if we want to make these as a social institution, it really ought to look like X.
With all the research you've done, possibly looking at other countries and the way they handle things, what regulatory changes do you think would make the biggest difference in helping this problem?
So again, we look at the problem of gambling disorder. We know it's there. Is it escalating compared to 20 years ago? In some communities, yes. In other communities, no. Definitely in the online space is probably the greater concern. I now have most of my patients coming in have never set foot inside a brick and mortar casino.
Wow.
Why? Why would they? You're 20, 21, you're Gen Z, you had the pandemic, you don't have a car, you got all the casino options on your phone. Why would you take the car, drive 90 minutes with cash that you don't know how to get from a bank and go into a casino where it's scary and interact with humans? I mean, imagine if you don't know how to play craps or Pai Gow or even Blackjack. I mean, how many like young men and women even know the basic rules in Blackjack? Right. And then they hit on 16 against a 6. Oh my God, what are you doing? Right. So you back it up. Number one, I think far and away is we start with the various stakeholders and government. I'll start with government. Government right now from a state level and from a federal level does very little to protect the public health when it comes to gambling addiction. Just no dedicated funds, no strong mandated regulations and rules that are actually enforced. Not really taking the whole thing seriously to just say, you know what, this does impact public health. And we need to do a better job to make sure that the games are safe. We need to shut down illegal online casinos. We need to make sure that the casinos are doing what they're supposed to be doing by the law. We need to look at advertising, all that stuff. All that stuff is government regulation, doing more, doing better, and doing what I call best practices. No state in America can say that they're actually doing that. Number two, on the casino side, is them having a long, hard look to say, what are we here for? Are we here to provide entertainment and fun like Disneyland? Or are we here to like squeeze as much money out to keep our shareholders happy? And if people die, they die, and people kill themselves, so what? I don't quite think that's right either. So I think what they could do a lot better, again, is, really looking at the types of games they're offering, the entertainment package they're offering, and determine, is this really what we want to do? And I think a brick and mortar casino, they have a lot of other options than, say, an online operator. So they could, for instance, not charge for parking. They could, for instance, go back to the $9 steak dinners. They could, again, offer games that have fair market value that you as a player feel like it's great. Can you guys even find a single deck or double deck handheld blackjack table in America anymore? It's hard.
Yeah, there are a few. But to your point, the 3-2 blackjack versus 6-5 blackjack that you're seeing everywhere, and people not understanding how much the edge the casino gets out of that game.
Or even cutting in a shoe and they change the shoe out like midway, right? I mean, small stuff like that. So in other words, what could be different? Casinos could offer, in my mind, a better entertainment experience. And then the back end, again, it's really the folks who consume gambling, who I think we need to do a much, much better job of explaining to people what gambling is. In my mind, at its core, it's supposed to be entertainment. It's supposed to bring people together. It's supposed to give you some joy, but you're supposed to spend money on it. I use this analogy all the time. People always say, I lost money gambling. They don't say, I spent money gambling. I spent money watching the Dodgers. I spent money on the movie. I spent money on golf. They don't say, I spent money gambling, because there's this weird inherent wish that you want to win. And then when you don't win, it's like, oh my God, I lost. And for whatever reason. Instead of saying gambling is not a reliable way of making money as it currently exists for the vast majority of people who play these games. And that's, I think, where a lot of gamblers falsely believe, oh, I'm due to win big, or, oh, I'm going to get the same game parlay because my friend did, or I can make spectacular success. What you all do as professional card counters doesn't even make you a professional gambler. It means you just have a skill. You can be the greatest card counter in the world and still not making any money gambling. So I view, yes, card counting is a skill. Then blackjack then becomes a game of skill, not a game of chance. If you're playing it the way you're allowed to play it, it still becomes a game of chance if they manipulate the casino rules so that the best card counters, you could be like, what, plus 30 and you still can't win. So you put it all together, I think you're doing exactly what we need to do as a society, which is talk more about gambling, about what it is, what it isn't, and develop healthier expectations about what it can be. I think, again, the casinos view it as we're a business and we have to extract money from people, just like health insurance, just like any other business in America. But emotionally, I've often wondered, for casino operators, how do they feel when they put their heads on pillows at night?
Yeah.
The pharmaceutical industry or gun manufacturers. How do they sleep at night, knowing that their product killed kids, right? And again, I'm just wondering. And the people in the casino operator I work with said, well, I sleep great. I sleep really well. And there was one conversation I had with someone. I said, but yet people die because of your product. Lives are ruined. And he said to me, this was maybe 10 years ago, Tim, lives are ruined by every single industry we have in America. Coal mining, gas refinery, restaurant industry. There's always going to be a byproduct of every industry when it comes to business. To me, I was kind of cold, but that was his view. So I thought that was really yikes. But I think that's the thing. And again, what we see is these constant new tricks, I think, that are unsettling. The parking fee for me is really unsettling. And I don't know if that's a trend nationally. Is that a trend? Have you seen that nationally? Just Vegas.
That's a Vegas thing. But the dumbest money in the world's in Vegas.
Yeah. And just like paying for bags on airlines when that first happened was unsettling. But then after 20 years, the next generation of people don't know it as unsettling. They just assume it's part of the experience.
Are there any other new things that you've seen them do or are trying to do?
Yeah. I mean, a couple years ago, I saw this kind of value of if you have a player's card, you're going to get 10, 15% off the price of stuff. You're not getting 10, 15, 20% price off of anything. They're just raising the price of,
Yeah, it's already overpriced.
And you'd be like, oh, instead of paying $30 for a drink, you're going to pay $24. What I also see, at least in the brick and mortar casinos, is just a lot less of that human connection and value. The free drinks, the preferential seating at, a table, the free hotel room. But on the flip side, as an example, I have not set foot inside the Rio Hotel in probably about 10 years. I'm still getting emails giving me 4 free nights at the Rio.
Oh, yeah. You can always get free nights at the Rio.
I think probably me and SD1 are trespass from there. We still get free rooms at the Rio all the time.
And in the year were 1999, those rooms were going for what, $300-400 a night.
What? Wow.
The Rio used to be nice.
So those are some of the things that I see slowly in brick and mortar. But again, it's the loyalty programs tied to the heaviest gamblers, giving them really high-priced value of, again, not concert tickets, but free play. And again, I've had several patients that tell me it's $500 in free play automatically added to my account every month, even if I don't go. Because the one time they did go, they spent 15 grand. So that loyalty program to generate real value rewards is incredibly high. And we all know that those casinos are likely not taxed on that giving that money out, or it escapes regulatory capture, if you will. That was the whole thing in those sports books online. They were like, "Oh, we don't want to have to pay taxes on money we're giving off for these $1,000 free bets. We're just giving away product. We're giving away free product. We shouldn't have to pay taxes on that." And that's where a lot of the tax attorneys are debating. Like, no, you're actually giving away a large sum, and you should be paying corporate tax on that. Well, I don't follow the whole thing. But anyway, so those are things that I see there. But I think short of that, at least in the Vegas experience, it really is. Things are just super, super expensive. In the casino experiences outside of Vegas that I've been to lately, it's just different. So again, I'm from Chicago. So have you guys been to the downtown casinos in Chicago?
No, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact they're building one, a big one in the heart of downtown Chicago, which never existed, right? There's, the one right now. There was one by the airport. It was there maybe about 8-9 months ago, and it was packed on a Tuesday afternoon. Really high stakes, $25 craps minimum on a Tuesday. So the demand is still really there. People's ferocity of playing higher stakes remains there. There's also no other choices. And I think, again, what's luring them there is just the gambling itself, just the fact that you can do this, on a Tuesday unchecked, but also this idea that, you can make a lot of money quickly. There's still the fundamental part.
That's the difference, right? So the casino is constantly, through marketing, they're constantly telling the story. Come in, have fun, and win. You can win. You can be a winner. They stopped calling it gambling. It's gaming. It's entertainment. And that
win big.
Yeah, it's always win, win, win. If you do actually win, like we do, you're shown the door. But that marketing is, I don't understand in this day and age, after we've had a clampdown on regulatory wise on tobacco, on alcohol, in terms of how they market and how they advertise, how casinos get away with how they are able to market. I said this on the podcast with Brian, like they always claim we are so highly regulated. Well, they are on the banking side, specifically the banking side. But in terms of marketing or what they're allowed to, they have carte blanche. They can do whatever they want. And it seems like there's no force to stop them because there is no lobby for gambling studies and for pushing initiatives on the Hill or in states. So what can be done?
Yeah, so right now there's two things, and I'm sure you have talked about in your other podcast. There's two federal bills, the GRIT Act and the SAFE Act, that were the first two federally introduced pieces of legislation that would, call attention to these things, preserve money for gambling, problem gambling, research, prevention, and treatment. And those bills aren't gone yet. They're there. They're not likely to be heard. A bunch of other things happening right now we need to worry about. But at least there's some call and beginnings of that. Gambling advertising is a perfect example. The ads that we watch, are they false advertisement?
Yes.
Okay. So you look at the opiate epidemic, what ultimately did in the opiate crisis for pharmaceutical companies was lawsuits. Lawsuits saying you marketed a known addictive product, dismissed the value of addiction to the doctors and to the public. You are a public nuisance. You created a public nuisance. That's how they got nailed with the lawsuit. All the lawsuits up to now against the gambling industry have always been, I have a gambling problem. You knew it. You took advantage of me. I want my money back. And to my knowledge, every single one of those lawsuits have either gotten thrown out or sided with the gambling industry themselves, meaning, no, it's caveat emptor. You, sir, ma'am, are at fault for falling into this disease. You're on your own. So the pendulum will shift when there are a couple of major lawsuits brought against the industry. That's the only thing. That's what happened with tobacco. That's what happened with opioids. Alcohol industry got in front of this years ago and said, no, we know this is a problem. We're going to police ourselves. But they had a lot of right? MAD is a perfect example. Mothers Against Drug Driving took the tobacco alcohol industry to task, right? But again, you're right. The lawsuits is number one. They'll change the nature when that happens. Number two, federal legislation helps. But this is right now a state by state by state by state issue. So then you're going to get fractured regulatory standards. And then in every single state, no state has the resources to generate the law enforcement or the regulatory powers to go chase these things down.
Well, they're also in bed with them. They make money.
Well, I mean, the revenue comes back, but the revenue comes back as tax revenue, right? But it also goes back to at what cost. So when I spoke to the legislators, I say, listen, you might generate $16 billion a year in gambling revenue, but at what cost to the public health? Deaths, overdose, bankruptcies, divorce, lost productivity, lost time, gas spent driving to the casino, right? There's a hidden cost. Electricity to power these casinos, that's not cheap, right? All these things. And they're like, oh my gosh, I hadn't realized that. So we don't know whether it truly is a zero-sum game, 16 billion in, 16 billion out, or is it 16 billion in and 40 billion out? So no one's really calculated that. But to try and do prohibition and eliminate that is never going to work. And because of the demand for these products and the unregulated online space. So it really is a challenging environment. And you're right. The things that we can tackle that are relatively easy are underage gambling, are gambling advertising, if we have the fortitude to do it. As a legislator, they'll be like, I don't want to take on gambling advertising because I don't see the danger in it. That's part of the story. Where we're at UCLA, their buses going on campus, prize pick, underdog, it's sports betting in a state with no sports betting, right? And so you're right. The advertising has to be taken to task. And that's going to be things like the FCC or social media people to say, no, I'm not going to advertise this product because I think it's an unhealthy product. Why did that? I don't see ad for guns on TV. I never understood that. Are there laws that forbid that?
Yeah, I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't know if they're allowed to advertise.
You know what I'm saying? Like, imagine watching March Madness. You don't see a gun ad. You don't see a tobacco ad. You don't see a cannabis ad. You see tons of alcohol ad, but they're muted, right? And it's an industry that's highly regulated at the federal level, the state level, lots of taxes, lots of money set aside for alcohol-related problems caused by alcohol. So again, gambling, state of California, our budget to deal with gambling addiction is about $9 million a year. Our budget to deal with alcohol addiction and drug addiction is around $600 million. So there's a huge discrepancy. So how do we change that narrative is, again, the human stories need to get out. The human tasks get out. And it's really hard because who wants to go public and say, I have a gambling problem? And some people do, like Brian Hatch, and all the voices on his podcast come out. But again, until the government starts to say, you know what, this is a concern that my constituents are telling me about, or this is a concern I'm worried about. Until the lawsuits start getting through that are effective, that sue, we're not going to see that. There's one lawsuit I'm aware of where they're suing the casinos. The casino industry are supposed to give out year-end statements of how much you won or lost in this state. They're not doing it. They're like, it costs money. We're not doing it. Screw it. So they're just not doing it. Well, this law firm is going after them saying, you're not following the laws. You owe people. You should be held to task. So there's stuff like that. But again, that's really where it's at. The opiate story is a perfect example. Opiate epidemic rises up for 15, 20 years. We'll call it from early 90s to mid 2000. Prescriptions are through the roof. Everyone's making a ton of money. Drug companies, doctors, pharmacists, distributors, right? Everyone thinks this gravy train is going to go on forever. But then there's a tipping point, and that tipping point are the number of dead. More people start to die. Deaths go up. Misery goes up. Calculus of pain go up. Lawsuits start to happen. People are like, why is this happening? This isn't good. And we've all lived it. We've seen it. But that same story with opiates, will it be repeated with gambling? I certainly hope not, because that's a lot of terrible things. I definitely think we are on the upswing over, in the first quarter of that story. It may not seem that way. It's really only the last 15 years we've seen this upswing in gambling, normalization, and all those ads. Again, 15 years ago, when it came to just brick and mortar casinos, very different story than what you're seeing right now, right? In terms of experience and even ads and clientele that are in there.
It looks like guns are not prohibited federally or in state from advertising. It's just that major media platforms and television networks and social media companies have strict policies against gun ads. They just don't let them.
Even though millions of Americans love guns.
Yep.
They made a decision to say our morals, I guess, of this broadcast. Again, you don't see sex toys ad, and millions of Americans use that too, allegedly. That's a sort of pushback. If, let's say, NBC or Fox or ESPN says, you know what, no, we're out of the gambling business. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to show the odds. We're not going to put ads on there. They could do that. They just choose not to. Now they are one and the same. They are the same product. I think that's the part that many of us never predicted would ever happen. At least in the brick and mortar casino world, right? Are you seeing a lot of uncomfortable partnerships between casinos and other things in life? And for instance, one of the things we were worried about was being able to spend credit cards at the table. Have you seen that yet?
Yep.
Are there any casinos in America, right? Where literally you don't have to go walk to the ATM. You can sit there, tap your card at the table, Apple Pay, and get another 500.
Oh my God. That's crazy.
Yeah, the players' cards are now on mobile devices too, so you can just reload a slot machine using your phone, which is hooked directly to your credit card.
Yeah. So it's kind of there. So we're talking about that sort of thing already, technology making it super, super easy. And again, where do casinos come in? Because that's a matter of convenience for the player.
I just wanted to close with first thanking you for all the work and research you've done, because I always wonder myself, I think a lot of other card counters wonder too. It's like, who is on the other side of these casinos advocating for change? Who is doing that? And it's really awesome to see that you're one of those people that is a strong force behind getting to that point of getting some change out there. But what is the best form of treatment, and what can people do to get help when they do realize that they have an issue?
And again, thanks for having me on your podcast. And again, your audience is very different than the audience I usually speak to, which are gambling providers or patients or people who are interested in mental health kind of stuff that we're doing here. Number one, I would think is this. Every state in America now has some form of gambling treatment available, either through state-funded treatment programs or through therapists that have been trained by gambling experts. We also have national telehealth companies like Kindbridge, which is every state in America. You can log on for telehealth and get a gambling expert, treatment, paid for by your health insurance. So that's pretty cool. So, but people say, well, what does treatment look like? Well, it looks like any other addictive disorder or mental health disorder. It's a combination of biological treatments like medications or other things that we have at our disposal, psychotherapies that work to help people understand their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors around gambling and come up with alternatives for a better quality of life, and social treatments like Gamblers Anonymous and focusing on things like improving exercise, sleep, and other things like that to just improve their overall quality of life. So unfortunately, the problem is that we see by the time people call my office looking for help, it's pretty severe. It's like metastatic, right? It's like really lots of damage, desperation, crises, don't know what to do next. So instead, we got to figure out, how do we get folks who are beginning to be curious about gambling or who are in the first few years of their gambling behaviors, how do we get them to come in and see a professional? And that's very, very difficult. Because the first few years of any gambling addiction, there's still a lot of wonderful moments. You're not reaching desperation, and you still view gambling as the solution, not the problem. So when you lose money, you're like, oh, I'll just get it back by gambling. So by nature, if someone said to you, oh, go see the gambling therapist, you'd be like, well, why should I? So I think eventually what we're going to reach a point is, it's kind of like when you go in and take your car into Jiffy Lube, you go for maintenance, but every now and then you get told, oh, you know what? You ought to get your brakes changed. No one wants to get their brakes changed. No one wants to get their engine flushed, but you do it anyway because that's part of maintenance. And I think eventually we're headed that way, where it's when you're going into either a primary care doctor or a general therapist or someone for just straight mental health and wellness, then we'll come out, oh, you know what? One of the things of concern here is your gambling behavior could get worse. And if so, here's how you stop it. But I think honestly, it's just people who are curious getting started. Like when you guys all got started with card counting, right? It's like there's a curiosity, there's a passion. And then you sought mentorship, you sought coaching, you sought the community of other card counters. It's the same thing with gambling. Is when people start gambling, I think it'd be better if we had better, like almost like manuals and like how to gamble and how not to develop a gambling disorder, how to keep it in line. Again, for me, the first few times I went to a casino, I didn't know anything. And then just through life experience, you kind of adapt. But when I took that class on craps and I learned about these betting systems, in many ways that helped prevented me from developing a gambling addiction, because there were now these things I could recognize to limit damage and limit financial losses. So put it all together, treatment works for folks with gambling disorder. Treatment is available now, much more so than it was 15 to 20 years ago. But we really had to say to anyone who's just curious about your own gambling behavior, and if you want to make sure it doesn't evolve into something worse, that's the time to go see somebody. So if you're a regular gambler, if you go to the casinos or you do online and, a couple of times a week, I say that's the time to go talk to somebody to make sure that you keep it in the lane of entertainment. When it comes to substances, I get this all the time. I get the folks who are like, I use methamphetamine a few times a year or cocaine a couple times a year, and I'm just really worried about its effect on my body. Those folks come in all the time, and they're not severe addiction. They're in the beginning phases, and we do the work. So put it all together. My message is that if you're curious about your gambling and you want to ensure you don't develop a gambling disorder, go seek a consultation with a gambling addiction specialist. If you're concerned about your gambling to the point where it's creating damage, pause and then go into professional treatment, and you'll get some help that way. And one last thing, if people want to know more, they can take a look at our website, www.uclagamblingprogram.org, or 1-800-GAMBLER gets you to the helpline in every state in America for gambling support.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Fong. This was really, really insightful. It was really great to hear about all this.
Good. And I'm happy to come on again if you want to do a deeper dive on other stuff.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.